Hey, my name's Renee Robyn, and I'm a photographer and composite artist, and welcome to the Photoshop Virtual Summit for Chapter 2 on compositing tips and tricks. So, if you're super new to compositing and this is like your first kind of foray into it, there's a bunch of really easy, fun ways to do compositing that doesn't require a big studio and a ton of lights and all this other stuff. So, my favorite way when I first started, and I actually couldn't find the original files for this, that's how long ago it was, but it was so much fun. And it's really popular to do, is like the floating girl, right? And there's tons of stuff about it online, but let's just go through it here quickly, because, I mean, you might know this, but you also might not. Basically what it is, it's combining multiple shots into one file. So what it is basically is you walk up to a scene, and you put your camera, I'm going to say that this is a camera, we put it onto a tripod. With 3 terrible legs. And then what we do is we take a picture of the entire scene with nobody in it. But you got to pick a focus point. So that's the important part, because if you look at this, of course, everything is like, you know, it's a shallow depth of field, and so if you blow focus, if I was focusing back here on this, then obviously trying to composite this area here would be really, really difficult. So what I did was I basically had someone walk into where we were going to set the stool up, and I put the focus, so I put the camera onto autofocus, focused where they were, and then I just hit the lock button, so I switched it to manual focus, so that wasn't going to search for focus anymore. And then I took a picture of the entire scene. So there's nobody in it. There's no her, no nothing. There's only this environment, so this whole space here. And what that means is I now have my plate. I have my piece that is completely blank that I can composite in later. And then what we did was we brought in this like stool thing. Actually, I think it was more like a piece of cupboard furniture. We found it in this abandoned house that we found out in the middle of nowhere. But anyways, so then what I did was I asked my friend to just like lay back on it and pretend she was comfortable. And one of the big things with making floating girls is you have to try to get rid of the gravity, because if they're floating, they're not supposed to be, you know, being pulled down by gravity. They're anti-gravitic. So I was like, okay, well, I was like, just try to look really comfortable. And so basically I had this picture of her laying on this piece of furniture. And so what I did in Photoshop then later was I had my background piece. I had my whole plate where, like, you know, there was nothing there, not even her. And then I put the picture of her laying on the furniture over top of it. And then what I did was I made what's called a layer mask. So this little flag of Japan looking thing right here. And the mask is white, so I want to paint with black. Masking works on a grayscale. And all I did was I masked out the piece of furniture that she was laying on so that it disappeared. It did take a little bit of work to figure out. I mean, you can see this is like early Photoshop for me, and if you saw the previous lesson, I say how much I dislike the soft round brush for masking. Well, this is why. This is what happens when you use a soft round brush for masking, is you get these little like pieces here. Actually, I'm going to get rid of that layer mask, so that's going to be easier. Basically what you see here though is you see these like soft edges going around the body, whereas here where I haven't been masking, the edges are normal and hard. So this is a really good example as to what I was talking about in the previous lesson, to try and avoid the soft round brush as much as you can, because you get these weird bleed lines and stuff, and it's kind of strange looking. But anyways, that's like basically the easy way to do, like, you know, the pretty floating girl. You take 2 pictures, one picture with nothing in it, and then one picture with your friend in it, or your subject, or whatever. A few years later, I tried to do like a slightly more complicated version of that, because I was like, you know, this one's really fun. There's no movement in her hair, and her clothing is form-fitting, and, you know, like, let's see how I can do this better a few years later. So this still, I couldn't find the original files for it, because it was 8 or 9 years ago now. So I was wrong. I went back after recording this because I was like, this sucks not having the original files. So I dug through hard drives even further, and I found the file of this image. So I did say that I didn't find it because I couldn't find it, and I could not. I had to dig through a bunch of drives. But anyways, I found it. So now this is going to make a lot more sense. So what I was talking about with taking multiple shots, when we look at this image, okay, so this was the original. This is what I'm talking about, like these are all the things that are in the image, right? And then this is everything. This is only the image. Let's disable this mask here. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying getting a clean plate. So your camera's on the tripod and you just get a picture of everything in the frame once everything's locked in focus. And then, of course, you get your picture of your person and then you mask them out. So this is my sister sleeping on these boxes. I thought they were crates. Clearly memory is faulty. It is definitely apple boxes. So we put this, and I took a picture of her laying on them, and then this pillow was kind of sucking. So this is something that can happen when you're working on these kinds of composites, is that these pillow edges here, they don't make sense because they like fold over and stuff. And so my solution to that was to just get another part of a pillow and mask it in, and then I wound up handling that little bit of apple box sticking out there on its own layer. Anyways, if I had been smart, so in the final image, which is up here, it's this combination, it is like the pillow is really bright. That didn't work at all. But the final image, the pillow is really bright. I'm going to pull up, where is the JPEG? I have it here. Or maybe I don't. Well, maybe I don't have the JPEG here. That's okay. Whatever. Anyways, so the thing that I noticed in this image when it was all said and done, and I wish I had done sooner, but I wasn't, this is a bunch of years ago, and I wasn't as experienced as I am now with compositing. So what I didn't realize until many, many years later was that this pillow is way too bright and it's super, super distracting. So there's a bunch of ways that I could correct this. Now, the easiest way to do it would have been to do it when I was still working with the raw files, when I was sitting here looking at this being my blank slate. So here I tried to make it a little bit darker. Oh, there's my sister's dog. Anyways, so here I tried to make it darker. Now, if I had been smart on this, what I could have done is merged everything into the singular layer here. So Alt-Command-Shift-E on your keyboard, and I could have just gone into ACR and grabbed my highlights and just pulled them down. And then I hit OK. And then I want to invert that, so I just want to hide it everywhere else but the pillow, and that is the wrong type of brush for this. Again, picking the right brush for the job is important. Obviously, too soft is not going to work. But if I had just underexposed this a little bit, I think this image would have come together a lot nicer. That really bright pillow wouldn't have been as distracting as it is in the final image. Because if we go up here, so here you can see I'm starting to build in all the layers. So I'm adding, different textures over top of it, some glittery stuff, which is colors basically smashed on. And then I just popped it into Color Effects. So Nik Color Effects Pro, it's a plugin that I really, really love and I've used for a long time. And so then just adding the wings, because I was oh, this is cute, but the wings, maybe this will be better. Adding more glowy stuff, changing the colors around, using color lookup tables. These are right here. This little half circle thing down at the bottom of the screen. And you go color lookup. And there's basically these presets that come in Photoshop, and they can change the look of your image if you put it in the right order. Again, the order of things really matters. Anyways, so yeah, so if we just tap through this, you'll see all these different color profiles that come basically stock with Photoshop. Anyways, so I made one of those, and then I did some selective color adjustments, And basically what this color lookup table did was it changed the color of the dress from green to blue. And again, this goes back to using colors that are not necessarily found in skin or in the environment. And at this point, there was no more green left because I was like, I want it to be fall. So, yeah, just like, you know, more selective color adjustments, fixing some contrast. I found this area here to be kind of distracting. So I think I just like flipped part of this image. You can see the repeating pattern here, which is a no-no in compositing. Again, another thing that I would change in this image going forward. Don't have repeating patterns. Don't try to like flip. If you're going to try to flip, at least photograph another area that's got, you know, similar light, and then try flipping that instead. These repeating patterns are really obvious and bad habits. But yeah, it's just like, you know, this little light up thing here is the same thing I did with Ray with the orange glow. I just did it with white instead of orange. And then some sharpening. At the time I was using high pass filter to sharpen, and now typically the best way I find to sharpen is using Photoshop's Smart Sharpen. So they have this really great, I'm just going to merge this all into one layer. So this is one thing about Smart Sharpen. As far as I know anyways, it has to work on a flat layer like this. So merge everything up, Alt-Command-Shift-E, and go Sharpen and then Smart Sharpen. And so it's pretty rad because you basically can just click on an area of the image and you can decide, you know, what your radius you want it to be. Are you getting rid of lens blur, Gaussian blur, or motion blur? So is your subject blurry because it was moving? And anyways, I don't usually put the radius up too high because obviously you can get this like really crunchy, it just doesn't look good. Well, basically it just, if you push it up too much like this, it looks like that, and that looks terrible. So I don't push the radius very far, not usually much past 1. And I don't think I've ever gone over 200 for sharpening because it's just too sharp. But anyways, so I do find that the Smart Sharpen filter is actually quite rad, and it did not exist at the time that I made this image. So if we just like zoom in here and turn that on and off, it's probably hard to see on a video recording, but anyways, play with the Smart Sharpen filter is super great. But to darken this pillow, so again, this goes back to the problems that can arise when we're working with compositing. White, once it's white, it's really hard to do anything with, which sucks. So, I mean, I can do what I was talking about earlier, just go into Adobe Camera Raw, which is Control or Command Shift A, and knock down my highlights a bunch, and see how that handles it. Ideally, going forward in the future, if I was to make this kind of artwork again, I would use a light gray pillow instead. I wouldn't necessarily use white anymore, just because of this exact problem. Like, everything else in my image is quite dark, and it's soft and it's pretty and stuff, but like the white just overexposes so easy. And that sucks because now it means that I have to correct it. I did print this eventually, and that was the first thing I noticed, was just like, oh my god, it is so bright. What am I doing? So do try to keep that kind of stuff in mind when you're working on these. That the material that you're photographing can make or break or really frustrate you when it comes to your editing process. Obviously, of course, you could just be like, we'll just be a better photographer and light it better. Like, yeah, but you could also just save yourself a ton of work and just use a non-pure white material. You know, or if that's the other case, put it in an environment that doesn't have so much darkness around it so that you're not having to like find somewhere in the middle that isn't quite as frustrating. So this is kind of looking a little bit better. I might try to add like a curves layer to add some shadow. So that's just a little like half circle down here is just going to create a curves layer. And I would maybe try to just like copy some of this over. So to copy a layer mask is Alt, click, and drag, and it's going to say, do you want to replace your layer mask? You say yes. So now obviously it is way too much over this, and that's not going to work, but I kind of just want it on the bottom anyways. So I'm going to use like a larger brush. I'm going to make it softer. and I am painting on the wrong mask, the wrong layer. Again, this happens all the time to me, and that's fine. So what is going on here? X. Click on the layer mask. There we go. Alrighty, so if I try to just like pull this out a little bit, make that mask harder again. Pull this off here, soft that brush. Because obviously a hard edge brush on that case is gonna really look strange. Here, we can maybe soften this a little bit. My computer is just starting to scream at me, just like, what are you doing to me? Why? That's normal. Anyway, so that gets it pretty close. Now, the downside is I have this really ugly line here. So these kinds of things, this is the problem of fixing it later. Like if I had just done this correctly when I first was working on this file, I wouldn't be trying to like micro fix these tiny little hard lines, because obviously it looks composited. As soon as you have those really hard edges, it looks like it's fake, because, well, it is. You're trying to pretend that it's not, even just like a little bit, right? So it means going in here and putzing around and trying to get this right. Let me see here. Kind of getting there. Now the one thing to keep in mind a little bit is that like some of this highlight here on the bottom isn't the end of the world, because there is a little kick of light on the bottom of her feet right down here. But it is distracting though, and it is, admittedly, it's just because I know that we've worked on it, and I know that just by staring at it I'm like, something's wrong, it doesn't normally look like this. The colors are off as well, it should be a different shade. Fixing stuff after you have done your color correction and after you've done a bunch of compositing totally sucks, and it takes so much longer. It would almost be faster at this point, instead of like going around and like trying to micro fix all these tiny little details, to just like pull everything back, like delete, well basically not delete, but hide a bunch of these layers. So if I just got rid of this, got rid of that, anything where there was a merged layer like this, it's almost quicker to fix it here. So did I not? Guess I did. Okay, so I did underexpose that a little bit more there, so that's kind of looking a little bit better. So if I did this, now I did some color effects stuff that I don't even know what it is anymore. But if I merge everything up, so I'm just going to pop into, I'm going to do, instead of a Color Effects Pro thing, I'm going to jump into Adobe Camera Raw. Because the nice thing with ACR is you can save your own color profiles, and what I've done is I basically have a bunch of these pre-made that I have made over the years with, you know, digital art and so on, where I kind of like what I did. And so whenever I get a new client or something, I kind of just like save how this looks. So if I go to my hue, let's look at the greens. That dress is not picking up as green. What color is it? Maybe I merged too soon. Delete. Now, that was a color lookup that gave me that blue, wasn't it? It is a color lookup table. Okay, so that's not too shabby. Let's see. Maybe if I take that out first and this out. So what if I take out my atmospheric elements first and I just kind of play with the color and see if I can find a nice color balance. So merge this up to a new layer on its own. Command Shift A or Control Shift A for fellow PC users. Actually, that's quite pretty. So basically what's happening here is I have these hue shifts that are happening in the dress and everything else that's going on in this image. Everything's been cranked around a bunch. Saturation has been pulled all over the place. And I don't want to have too much orange in there. That's a little strong. Now it's starting to look kind of like fairy tale-ish. Kind of digging it. So we go from here. Highlights are pulled down quite far, which works for me, especially for this shot. Those highlights were such a nightmare. And let's see. This is really starting to look better, though. I mean, it's so funny. If you ever go back and edit some of your old work, you know, like you open up your old PSD files and like, what is it? What would I like about it? What would happen if I did this? That's kind of what's happening right now with this image. It's really kind of fun for me. I'm kind of enjoying this. So let's see if I turn up the contrast a teeny tiny bit. And then I go okay. So now I'm wondering if I pull these blue things over, is it just gonna like totally mangle? It is the wrong color shift. Through and through, it is incorrect. So what I can do here, so I can turn off that layer. I can, now that I've added these color layers back on top, I can go Alt-Control-Shift-E, again, merge them all up into one. And now what I can do, what happened? What's turned on? Oh, right. That explains it. Okay, so remember, whenever you merge everything, it includes all your visible layers. So let's turn off stamp invisibility. Let's turn off these. If I'm going to do this, I should do this above here. So your layer order is super important. What was happening is when this was merging up underneath these other layers, I was getting like triple stacks of all these effects that were above it. So now if I go here, filter, camera raw filter, basically it applies the decisions that I just made to this layer. And I can go, oh, that looks a lot prettier, or like maybe that green stuff is a little too strong and I don't need it to be quite so strong. So I can turn off, I can basically like go back in time, delete or turn these down a bit. Like it's a little too strong for my flavor. These days anyways, younger me thought it was great. Alt-Control-Shift-E, again, merge them up onto the top. Filter, camera raw filter, or Alt-Control-F or Alt-Command-F. And that looks a lot better. There's a little bit of a hiccup here down here in the corner. You can see this like tip of the line here, and I'm just gonna crop that out. So, yoink. And we're gonna let it render, because my poor computer is screaming at me right now. Okay, so I'm still tempted to try another technique to darken this pillow just a tiny, tiny bit. So I'm going to go to my burn tool. I'm going to set it on highlights. And I'm going to see what happens. And I'm doing this right on the layer just because I'm experimenting to see what happens. And I realize there's a bunch of composite artists out there that would be like, no! But sometimes it does the trick. Sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. Because I don't want to flatten it out. That's the one thing that like using these burn tools can do, is they can kind of just like smuts up a whole photo. And I just want it to be like just a little less obvious that, I can do the trick. So if we take, this was the shot before, I'm going to delete this layer mask. So this is how I've color graded it now, and that was before. So obviously I do like this more closed in area here, but I didn't go that far back because time. Basically time. But yeah, so essentially that's how you make like a floating girl, is you go back, you photograph your background plate. So you photograph your subject, you photograph your background plate, and delete. Okay, photograph your subject, leave your camera on the tripod, lock your focus, pull everything out of there, and then start masking them in. And then fix everything that you need to, especially when it comes to working with fabrics and materials. Stuff sometimes floats around funny, so you gotta like get a little creative with it. And then start smashing color at it and layers and trying things out, see what works, see what doesn't work. And every now and then you might get surprised and find something that you really super like that maybe you didn't plan for at all, like this one up here. So yeah, floating girls, a million different ways to do it. I actually recommend going back and checking out your earlier PSDs and see how you would do it differently, because obviously this one here I haven't touched in many years, and my tastes have clearly changed. So the next thing I want to talk about is shooting backgrounds. So backplates are a massive part of a compositor's arsenal, especially if you can photograph your own. I realize this is totally not possible for a lot of people around the world, but if you have the opportunity to shoot your own stuff, I do recommend it, because if you photograph your own stuff, you're going to have more control. So one of the things that I can't recommend enough is photographing your stuff with a locked-in color balance. So don't leave your camera on auto. Pick a color balance that's working for that day, and then shoot that entire light scenario on the same color balance, because what can happen is you can get color shift when you're photographing your stuff. And yes, I understand you're probably shooting in RAW, and yes, I know you can change it later, but it's so much easier when it's all locked in. I shoot 90% of my plates on the same color temperature, just because it's easier later. Everything's going to require a little bit of color tweaking and so on. I understand this, but it does make my life a ton easier. So an example of this is I actually photographed all of this stuff on the same color balance. And you can see how it changes from image to image to image, but it doesn't change as much as it would if I had left it on auto, because what can happen if I had left this on auto is I could wind up with like really cool for one shot, depending on what my camera's looking at, and really warm for another, or like really magenta or whatever. Anyways, it's just a thing. Being a little neurotic about the stuff that I am, I really dislike having everything on auto. So I pick a color temperature and I leave it at that. So also, if you're shooting your own backplates, I do recommend shooting everything on a couple different lenses if you can. I like to shoot stuff on wide, and then I like to shoot stuff really compressed, because some composites look really great, especially if you're shooting like a 3/4 and you're not really showing the feet or anything like that. A compressed background can look really nice. Sometimes it doesn't look good at all and it doesn't work, but if I'm photographing someone in the studio and I'm shooting a 3/4, chances are I'm shooting them at like 85mm or longer. And so I'm going to choose a background plate that's shot at 85mm or longer, because it makes sense. Your brain can figure it out. Because images that were photographed on a long lens and then a wide angle background, unless it's done really well, which I've seen done, but it's not very often, something in your brain tells you something's off, because we look at reality all day long. We look at photographs that are shot on location all day long. So I just try to keep that in my mind when I'm building these backgrounds, that I try to match my lenses as much as possible. The other thing I try to match a lot is my aperture. So I will photograph stuff at varying apertures so that I have ways to change my mind later. So if you photograph someone in the studio, let's say 3/4, and you photograph them at like f2.8. So if you had photographed someone, and let's say you were even just putting a texture behind them, right? If you photograph someone at f2.8, they're not going to be sharp all the way through, right? They're going to be soft. And that looks great. So when you're putting your backgrounds on, blur them appropriately. This goes back to photographing stuff on location and figuring out at what distance, what kind of blurriness it is, and then playing with the different blur settings that exist within Photoshop to kind of mimic that as best that you can. Another thing that I can't stress enough is focusing. So when you're out photographing your back plates, pick a spot where if you were talking to you in your studio or whatever, where would you put someone? Are you the kind of person that puts like little people down here? Are you, I mean, like myself, I'm addicted to center compositions, which I realize is not great, especially if you want to win competitions, which is probably another reason why I don't enter very many. But, you know, or are you going to build a series of people or objects or something throughout the frame? Where is your key person or key subject matter going to be? And so, especially if I'm photographing in low light situations, I always try to keep this in mind and I move my focus point around. Because the last thing I want is to be compositing something and then all of a sudden realizing, like, crap, where I want to put the person, it's out of focus. That sucks really bad. So these images, these are shot at like f16. It doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant. It is pretty much sharp all the way through. And that doesn't matter. So if you're in highlight situations, it's irrelevant. But something like this, these areas here on these shots, these are kind of soft. You know, I think focus for these is like somewhere way out here. And even that, I know with these kinds of images, I'm going to be building far away background pieces for it. So I'm not really interested in this area here. Sometimes what I'll do is I will back button focus and I will focus on the ground in front of me and then so I'll focus on the ground in front of me and then move the camera up and then take the picture. So I'll lock in the focus so that then I get kind of a more natural looking blur in the background that I don't have to do it later, because I don't know what it is, man, but Gaussian blur just makes me crazy. I don't like how it looks. It looks weird to me, and especially with an image like this, if you were going to put this in onto a background, how much everything blurs out changes. So if we look in on this, and we look at this shot, and it's like, okay, well, this is sharp-ish. This is less sharp-ish. This is less sharpish. This is getting worse and softer and softer and softer, right? So, I mean, all in all, this shot's not very sharp anyways. It was handheld and dark. But anyways, so the thing, if you're going to be blurring in backgrounds like this, you have to keep in mind you can't just like blur the entire thing and be good, because that's not how life works. So if you're trying to recreate blur in an image and you're wanting to create depth with it, the way that I like to do it the most is by basically stacking the image and then changing the blur ratios all the way through. So I'm going to duplicate this layer a bunch of times. So I'm going to have like blur 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to have an image, a layer that isn't blurred at all. So this one, we're just going to call this one static, or whatever word makes sense for you. Then this one, let's see here, this is going to be blur 3. So it's going to have the most blur. And then this is going to be blur 2. This is going to be blur 1. Okay, so the static layer we're going to turn off because we're not blurring any of that. So, blur number 1. I'm going to use box blur. I'm just going to go blur, box blur, and I'm going to go 3 pixels. Then I'm going to go filter, blur, box blur. Well, let's turn off the visibility so we can see what we're doing. Filter, blur, box blur, 6 pixels. And then filter, blur, box blur, 12 pixels. Despite all my hate for the Gaussian blur, if that's what works for you, do it up. Like I said, I've said so many times, there's no real solid, fast way to, like, you know, this is the right way or this is the wrong way. It's just a way that I don't like, and I don't like how it looks, but that is all. So, in this case here, I'm going to pick a brush that is relatively hard, but not too hard. And first things I'm going to look at is I'm going to create my first layer of blur in the image if we were going to be compositing this. So always pay attention to your depth of field. So let's say I wanted to blur, if I'm looking at this, everything from here back. Because like, let's say this hill, I kind of like the sharpness that it's at. But let's get rid of the one behind it. Let's push that back a little further. And we'll blur all this. So this is also, I see this happening a lot when people do sky swaps on an image that is shallow depth of field. You're going to have to blur, especially like clouds like this that are very clearly stacked. You're going to have to blur them in a way that makes sense to the aperture that you photographed it on. So in this case here, this is layer number 1. So now we're going to do layer number 2. So we're going to go one step further. So what I want to do now is blur the mountains that are further away yet. So I'm going to do all of these guys, those little bit of clouds. You can hear my computer starting to scream at me. But I want to make sure that I'm not hitting these edges of the mountains here. So see how I went a little bit over here? I want to not do that. These rocks are prime example for that brush that I like so much. In this case, one of those chalk brushes. Because these edges have texture. Let's see here. Oh, I am painting the wrong color. Nope, I was not. If you do that sometimes, it's okay. So do I. Okay, so I want to make sure that I catch those edges and those transitions there. And I want to make sure that I'm not screwing with this horizon line here, because that should retain its sharpness based on the depth in the image. Okay, so now we're going to go and we are going to reveal the blurriest part in the image, which is going to be the part that's the furthest away. And that'll be these mountains here, along with the interacting clouds along that line of depth. And this is typically how I will create depth in my composites, even if I'm doing like a single swap, like a single piece in the background, if I find that it's just looking too sharp. So if we turn this on and off, so that's on and that's off. So on, everything is all sharp and looking the way it is, and then off, kind of looking like this. So now this will make more sense if I decide to composite someone in with a background that was more shallow. So I would probably crop out that bottom stuff there and go from here, and that would probably give me a really good starting point to come from, because if you photograph someone on location, they're not just like all of a sudden everything behind them is one blob of blur. So just a really quick, easy way, and it works obviously really nicely with mountains because the lines are very specific, and it's really hard to do if you're trying to do in like a forested treed scenario. That is a nightmare. So choose your backgrounds wisely. Next on the list is going to be atmospheric depth. So again, this is easiest done with images that are very stacked. This happens a lot in normal landscape photography. And ironically, with landscape photographers, they like to try and take this stuff out. They like to go into Adobe Camera and they like to push this dehaze slider up so that they lose all of this atmospheric depth. So the ironic thing, how this stuff goes, is that if you're shooting it in real life, it shows good skill being able to get rid of it well. You know, focus stacking and dehaze work and all this stuff with landscape photography, and like, you know, in retouching, for example, like really great beauty retouching, is being able to remove the flaws for commercial advertising purposes in a way that isn't noticeable. Whereas a really good photorealistic painter can paint all the details of like the veins and everything like that. And so it's this weird standard that we have with art, with whatever is easiest. Good skill means that you can do the opposite and have it done well. So when it comes to compositing, if you were stacking a bunch of your stuff together, creating atmospheric depth or retaining atmospheric depth can make your images look less flat, because composites inherently can look very flat very easily. So one of the nice ways that we can do this is by creating atmospheric depth. And atmospheric depth is basically what you're seeing in these shots here, where stuff that's closer has more detail and has more contrast than stuff that's further away. Even in these shots here that are shot in a really, really bright sunny day in Death Valley, this is like, it's all this very similar color of red rock. But things that are closer are warmer, they have more detail, they have more contrast, than things that are further away, they are cooler, they have less contrast. So on and so forth. So it's actually quite easy to fake this stuff in post. I chose this image here just because it's really easy. If you wanted to create more atmospheric depth in an image as simple as this, what you can do is you can, well, my favorite way to do it, there's a bunch of ways to do it. This is the thing with Photoshop, and this is why there's a symposium on it, because there's so many ways to do the same thing. I have been having a lot of fun in Adobe Camera Raw lately, so I'm just going to show you that way. So I'm going to go into ACR here first, and this is a destructive way of editing, so keep that in mind. Destructive meaning that I'm basically making a decision and sticking with it. Non-destructive means I can change my mind. So in this case, I'm just going to warm up my foreground elements. I'm looking at these parts of the rocks here. I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm going to grab these guys here, and I'm going to go into ACR, and I'm going to cool this down a little bit. And I'm also going to take out magenta. I have a thing with blues. I don't really like the magenta tone in blues. It kind of bugs me. So I tend to add just like a tiny, tiny bit of green when it comes to the color grade in my cool tones. So in this case here, I'm going to put a layer mask on my furthest away area. Again, I'm going to go back to that sweet textured brush. And I was painting white on white again. So let's just pull this out here. And I'm doing this kind of quickly, but just to kind of illustrate what's going on. So this is just using color grading. This isn't even using, you know, like adding in other techniques that I'm going to show you here in a moment. But it's just a really nice way to color grade your composites, to make things, just to like pull separation on pieces, right? I like doing this very subtly. This is obviously a very strong way of doing this kind of color grade, but I like how it looks a lot, and I do this a ton in my images because it's pleasing to the eye and it's relatively easy to do. So just quickly nipping those guys there is a little bit here. There we go. Okay, so if we turn this on and off, that's our original, and the whole thing's kind of looking flat, even though we can see we have atmospheric depth in it. If we pull this out like this, that's actually looking pretty strong. And if I just turn down, that blue was like a little bit strong for me, is a little far. I can turn this down a little bit as well. So it's not as obvious, right? Because I mean, that's another thing that can happen when you start doing cool and warm tones in your shots, is it's just like, this is super warm and this is super cool and this is just how it looks. It's a lot. So an example of this that was used in a composite was I also chose my model and styled it so that she was going to look warmer. So we have this belt with the red paint on, she has red hair, and her skin, obviously, I didn't make her skin more pale. Sometimes I like to do that, but in this case here, I knew the environment that she was going to be in was going to have this like cold, desolate feeling, so I desaturated it a bunch and added in cool colors. But I made sure that I left her skin and her hair and the belt and even the shirt is actually, and the tails are like a warmer color, just so that it just kind of pulls her out ever so gently. So it's a nice like subtle way to create that effect. Basically using exactly the tools that I just showed you. I basically duplicated the layers in Adobe Camera Raw, and then I just warmed her up just like a tiny, tiny little bit, and then cooled down and desaturated the stuff around her. Another way that we can create atmospheric depth is by completely crushing out the detail altogether. So if we were to keep this mask, and let's just say we wanted to play with this a little bit further, we can create a new blank layer. we can take our paint bucket tool, which is the letter G on the keyboard, and let's just pick a color in the background here and paint it across the whole shot. So this is obviously way too much. Now, remember that thing I was telling you about copying up masks? Alt, click and drag, copy up the mask. So this is too strong, but let's say I wanted to do it kind of like this. And so now if I turn this on and off, again, another really nice way to add atmospheric depth. Now, something to keep in mind whenever you're putting a solid color layer over your image, what's going to happen is it's going to get rid of the noise in the shot. And if you have noisy images, like this one's moderately noisy, you want to be able to put some of that back. So just go noise, add noise, make sure you are on your layer and not your mask. It doesn't hurt to unlink the mask too. Basically, what can happen, so for example, if we wanted to blur this for whatever reason, if these are linked, then your mask is going to blur as well, and you're going to be sitting there going like, what the hell, why is this happening to me? So unlink a mask, click on this color layer and go filter, noise, add noise, and 12.5% is way too much. Okay, so go Gaussian noise, monochromatic, uniform. Uniform's nicer for this one, but make sure you click monochromatic because otherwise you're going to get this like pink and purple and stuff, and you don't really need that in there. So I typically add just like a very small amount of noise, so like 1%, something like that, just so that there's a tiny little bit. This can happen, this is the kind of stuff, like if you're only posting your stuff on the internet, like on Facebook and Instagram and stuff, don't worry about it. This matters more if you're getting into like printing and you really want your stuff to look nice. Then I would definitely be paying attention, zooming in up nice and close, looking at how much noise is in your image and being like, okay, well, how much of this do I really want to put in here? How much of this do I not? And then also keeping in mind like how much noise you plan on pulling out later if that is what your image needs. So anyways, the more of this that you do of your work, you're going to start noticing a pattern in your images, especially if you get any test prints done. And I do recommend getting test prints done, going to your local printer and just printing off some 8x12s or 8x10s and just looking at your work, like how does it look when it's in your hands and it's tangible, because artwork isn't really meant to live, in my opinion, on the internet all the time. I think that's kind of boring. So even if they just go into like a big folder that you have that's just your work and it's your progress over the years, it's a really easy way to go back in time and look at your work from like 2 or 3 years ago and go like, well, okay, am I getting better or am I stagnating? Am I what? You know, it's like a nice time capsule. And you can't just like re-edit it and pretend that it didn't exist either. So yeah, something I totally recommend. Anyways, so yeah, color toning. That is a really nice way, and that can create this kind of like crushed effect that's going on here, because even though this was shot this way in camera, if you are putting in like a heavy rainstorm or something like that that's coming into your scene, if you're trying to create that, then using that color layer, just like filling the scene with it and then masking it in, just how we did, can be a really nice way to kind of give you that beautiful atmospheric depth if you're not really wanting to add much blur or anything like that. Also, if landscape building is your thing, I highly recommend checking out some matte painting tutorials. That stuff will blow your mind. Okay, this is another good example. This is completely shot on camera. Again, a really nice example of things that are closer are warmer and have more detail, and things that are further away that don't. If you are also looking to kind of play with this a little bit, you can also use levels. So levels, if you're pushing in the middle here, you can just kind of grab this middle piece here and just kind of pull these around. And it's going to basically flatten out your image for you. And again, you don't necessarily want this on the entire image, right? Maybe you just want to push the background further away. In this case, this brush is the wrong texture for this environment. Let's see if we can find another one. Star, that's terrible. See if this will do the trick. Painting white on white again. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to do this quickly because otherwise it's going to take far too long. reality is what's going to happen is while I'm talking to you, I'm going to basically be fixing it in tiny little pieces anyways. The crazy thing is there's like a little tiny car. Let me see here. To like give this stuff scale, there's like a car right there. These rocks are so huge. Anyways, so I'll just crank these guys out nice and quick. So when we do this, once again, we're creating that illusion of like things have been pushed further away. Especially if you're putting in this background, like let's say you cut these rocks out and you're putting another background in, another set of rocks or something else. Adding that atmospheric depth is going to make them look less flat. So let's see what this looks like if we do this. Okay, so basically I'm just copy pasting something over here. Put that over top. Now I created this layer mask. Let's see what happens if I click and drag. So Alt click and drag. I'm going to unlink my mask because I just want to move up this background piece here and see what this looks like. So obviously if I was trying to copy this over, this little piece of horizon line here, this breaks this, that breaks the illusion. But if I pull this along here, it kind of works. It's not really an ideal choice, but if you're going to be trying to stack background pieces, it doesn't hurt to try and get pieces that already have atmospheric depth in them. Which is again why I'm so keen on if you can photograph your own stuff, that's the best option. It's definitely, you will get more of what you want out of this. Let's see, what if we try this guy? And admittedly, like, you know, when composites take me hours, it's literally because I am trying to figure something out. This is clearly a JPEG and not a RAW file, so we're just going to stretch this. I don't usually say that that's a good idea, but put that on top, drag this mask down, and let's move this around a little bit. So this actually doesn't work too bad. Let's get rid of that layer there. This is the hard part with background pieces like this though, is that we have these horizon line pieces here. So maybe if we were building this, maybe unless you were like like you really wanted to use this background piece, maybe this foreground piece here isn't really the right piece for you and you need to find something else, at least for these kinds of background choices. I wonder if I have any that are open here. Maybe. That's kind of compressed. And this is so much of compositing. It is literally just like, I wonder what happens if I do this, and I wonder what happens if I do this. There we go. That's looking better. So the compression is also adding really nicely here. Obviously, I'd need to do a better job on the masking. But this doesn't look too bad. Now, one of the things that we're running into here is the direction of the light. Obviously, if I create a new blank layer here, what we have first is this light is going this direction and then this light is going this direction. So that does not make sense. So what we can do, Controller Command T, right click and flip horizontal, enter. So now that is starting to make more sense. This light here though on these rocks, you can look at the shadows, so you can see that this light here, it is skimming across the top here. Draw on your blank layer. It is skimming across the top here, which is creating these shadows here. So this could technically kind of work. You probably, if this was going to be a choice that you really were like sold on, you would probably want to try and find these foreground elements here slightly more silhouetted. So maybe if you photograph them a little bit later in the day or something like that, then this background here piece would work, but you probably could fake it. You probably could like sell it if you really were sold on it. One thing that's happening here, of course, the color harmony isn't very good. So there's this thing that we can do. We can just go curves and we can clip it basically by holding Alt and this little square with an arrow pops down. And what that means is we can kind of play with the color temperature of only that singular layer. So, thing about adding that much blue is it starts to go magenta, and like I said, I don't like magenta very much. That's starting to work a little better. So if I turn that on and off, it's also brightened it a little bit, so again, it's like pushing it further away, right? I don't necessarily want this stuff to look exactly how it is. But yeah, when I'm building background pieces like this, like it'll just be like hours of just like throwing stuff at one after another, being like, yeah, does this work? Does this not work? I thought this was gonna work. This doesn't work at all. And so if that's kind of what's happening to you when you're building this stuff, super normal, totally okay. Don't feel weird or bad about it. It's super, super normal. Maybe there's artists out there that are like, oh, I get it right on the first try every time. I don't believe it. So yeah, don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to try, because you never know when something's totally going to work out for you, and what exactly that might be. Also, the other thing that can happen is just by like spitballing and throwing stuff at each other with just like a quick mask. Basically, it's the equivalent of like compositing sketching. You might get some really cool ideas of like, oh, I never really thought about that before. What if this? What if that? And I think that's one of the most important parts about doing this kind of stuff is like it opens your mind to more possibilities. And I think that is one of the best parts about being a creative person, is that you get to discover things while you're sitting by yourself. So to tie all this stuff in together, I have an image here that basically encompasses a bunch of the techniques that I've been talking about in these last two videos, especially when it comes to atmospheric depth. So I have this picture of an ogre that I had photographed when I was in Montreal a bunch of years ago, and this is actually still one of my favorite images. It was just really fun to make. Anyways, so what I did here was a bunch of the techniques I was talking about with adding atmospheric depth, including the stuff that I talked about yesterday. So what I've done is I have added a bunch of snow layers. I added multiple layers of mountains. So the nice thing is, with something like this, is I hid, so this, you can do this too, is if there's any like weird masking areas where you're like not really sure how things are going to intersect, just put a body in front of it. So I wasn't sure how to make these mountains here because they're from two different mountain ranges, how I was going to make them match in the middle. And then I was like, I'm putting a body there. But anyway, so this is mountain layer number 1, mountain layer number 2, mountain layer number 3. And what I did was I added more atmospheric depth, so the peaks would show, but I made atmospheric depth in between the layers so that they really stood out and pushed back, I didn't do much with the color between like cool and warm here because I just wanted this image to feel cold, really, really cold. And then I put, obviously, a bunch of snow layers on screen. I used a bunch of smoke layers. And I put more on the other side of him than on the back side because obviously if I just put tons of it on top of it just being like a big pile of snowy mess, it doesn't really work. What I wish I had done was I wish that I had had the foresight when I photographed this and added, contact snow in real life. And that really, I think, would have made this image a lot stronger. But I still am super happy with how it came out. Even though like this image is a number of years old now, I do still enjoy it just because it has a bunch of these things that I think are so fun about compositing, which is you get to create fantasy elements, you get to create mood and drama and all this stuff when you are by yourself and with your own thoughts. I know lots of people get really creative when they work with a big group of people, and I know I do, I love it, but when it comes to the editing, I really need to be by myself with the pixels and just kind of figuring out what it wants to look like. And I really hope that compositing becomes something like that for you, because digital art has definitely given me a voice and a way to speak in a way that I was really struggling before and never really managed to like get everything out all the way. So all that to say, I love compositing and I've really enjoyed being able to share all this stuff with you. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to me on social media. I do try to be very responsive, and I would love to hear from you. So thank you so much for watching. This has been a ton of fun, and I can't wait to see what you create next.